The butterfly, a cabbage white, his honest idiocy of flight, has never yet, it is too late, mastered the art of flying straight. He lurches here and there by guess and God and hope and hopelessness. Even the aerobatic swift has not his flying crooked gift. That's about me, not about the butterfly. And it's the irregularity of the flight and the unpredictability of the flight which makes the cabbage white survive in this difficult world. And that's rather true about poets.
Like the cabbage white butterfly, writer Robert Graves took many unpredictable turns on his fascinating journey through life. Though Graves would describe himself first and foremost as a poet, he was a man of enormous literary talent who wrote more than 150 books. He was eccentric, brilliant, and visionary.
Robert's views were certainly very bizarre and very extreme in some ways, and yet very often, in expressing these views, he seemed to come closer to the truth of things than many an apparently more sane, down-to-earth person.
Robert Graves' vivid imagination was fueled by a volatile mixture of emotional highs and catastrophic lows. His most memorable works emerged when the world around him was falling apart. At the peak of his writing career, Graves attempted to unravel the mystery of his creative process. That effort took him on a journey across time and culture through which he envisioned a mythical female muse. He called her the White Goddess.
It's very hard to say exactly what the White Goddess adds up to. It's wonderful, it's mad, it's an enormous great ragbag of ideas which are partially, possibly true. What really matters is that they were true for Graves. The White Goddess represents what made Graves inspired.
At the age of 46, Robert Graves had already written more than 50 books of poetry, fiction, and criticism. He was something of a cult figure who had always pushed himself to the brink in pursuit of his craft. Now he wanted to understand what it was that inspired his passion to write.
To be inspired, you need to be terrified. Now, this is very, very key to Graves's work. He describes it as the moment when the hair prickles on the back of your neck and you feel your teeth begin to chatter and your flesh is absolutely crawling with fear. And that, he says, is the moment when you know inspiration is on you and your poem or your poems are ready to be written.
By middle age, Graves had lived through many terrifying and inspiring moments that fueled his creative life. But his first experience with that awe-inspiring terror could have been his last. At the age of 19, he found himself in the trenches of World War I, a long way from London and his sheltered upbringing by his devout mother and father. For the first time in his life, he witnessed death up close and was deeply affected by it. In the moments when he put down his rifle, he picked up a pen and wrote graphic verses about the horrors of combat. One poem called A Dead Boche, meaning a dead German, captured the grisly reality of war.
Today I found in Mamet's wood a certain cure for lust of blood, where, propped against a shattered trunk, in a great mess of things unclean, sat a dead Boche. He scowled and stunk, with clothes and face a sodden green. Big-bellied, spectacled, crop-haired, dribbling black blood from nose and beard.
Robert Graves was one of the very first poets to write in what he tried to make a realistic way about life in the trenches. Graves was trying there to shock people and make them sit up and write in a way that people couldn't be complacent about what was going on and couldn't turn away their eyes to what was happening.
And what was happening to so many in the trenches soon happened to Graves. While he was fighting in France's Valley of the Somme, he was hit by an exploding shell.
He collapsed, was put onto a stretcher. The last thing he remembers before going unconscious was the stretcher bearer saying, "Old Gravy's got it."
At a nearby field station, Graves was left for dead. The Times of London listed Captain Graves among the thousands of young soldiers killed in battle.
His family received a report on his birthday, on his 21st birthday, that Graves had been killed. And Graves himself read of his death in a report in the Times, which he found a very bizarre experience.
Graves recovered and was discharged from the army. When he returned to England, he wrote about his near-death experience in one of his most famous war poems entitled Escape.
But I was dead, an hour or more. I woke when I'd already passed the door. Above me, on my stretcher swinging by, I saw new stars in the subterranean sky. Life, life, I can't be dead. I won't be dead. Damned if I'll die for anyone, I said.
When he wrote his poem Escape, Robert was clearing the ground for allowing himself to be effectively reborn. He wasn't quite certain how at that time, but he could say, I can reinvent myself. I can be who I want to be from now on.
He felt freed from his family's more conservative expectations for his future and made a vow to devote his life to poetry and poetic inspiration. In 1918, Graves married Nancy Nicholson, a talented young artist and ardent feminist. Graves and Nancy had 4 children and were determined to support their family through his writing and her art. They launched a literary journal called The Owl, but they only published 3 issues before it folded. They tried collaborating on a children's book written by Graves and illustrated by Nancy. But Graves was suffering from continuing bouts of shell shock, and his poetry was hardly the stuff of nursery rhymes.
Strangers, assume your phantom faces. You grin at me from daylight places. Dead, long dead, I'm ashamed to greet dead men down the morning street.
Unsurprisingly, the book went unpublished, and as Graves scrambled to support the family through his writing, his bouts of shell shock continued. Nancy, meanwhile, faced exhaustion and depression.
It was a very difficult marriage between 2 bright, highly motivated, very nervous people. By the mid-20s, the marriage between Graves and Nancy was in bad shape.
In an effort to save their marriage and recharge their artistic lives, they considered the unorthodox idea of inviting another creative person to become part of their busy household. Someone who would be a kindred spirit for Nancy and an intellectual companion for Graves. When they discovered the works of an American poet named Laura Riding, they decided to give it a try.
Graves was about to work on a history of modern poetry, and he felt that he would quite like to have somebody to work with him on it. And he felt that Laura sounded just the right kind of person. And also, he felt that it would be very nice for Nancy, because she was in this quite depressed state, and it would, kind of boost her morale, to have another woman there and perhaps help with the children. So they sent an invitation to Laura Riding in America and said, we really admire your poems, we both admire you. We would love you to come over and join us.
Riding accepted, and Graves met her at London's Paddington Station.
And there was this extraordinarily painted up, very elegant little woman. Not pretty, but very arresting.
Graves was struck by Laura's magnetic presence. As he accompanied her on the train ride from Paddington Station to his home, she exuded an aura of mystery and power.
There was a storm and lightning played around the train, and apparently Laura looked out of the window and said in very meaningful tones, "This is significant." And Graves was rather excited by this. He liked people who saw mystery and magic in things. And oh boy, had he found somebody who saw mystery and magic in Laura riding.
Laura quickly settled into the household, and Graves and Nancy felt as though they had found the answer to their marital problems. Laura offered Nancy relief from Graves' intellectual demands, and her presence lifted Nancy's spirits. Laura's influence on Graves was more profound.
I think it would be true to say that she more or less turned his world upside down. She taught him to think differently about poetry, taught him to think differently about society and the world.
With Laura as his editor, Graves' poetry grew sharper and more modern. Her presence rekindled his creative spark, and feelings for her began to come through in his writing.
Graves wrote a fascinating, very sexy poem about kissing a woman on the nape of her neck, which is quite a sort of sexy spot of the body. And this was Laura riding's nape.
Where kisses and all unconsidered whispers go smoother in than by the very lip, and more endeared because the head's asleep.
Graves had fallen completely under Laura's spell. With her, he had found the creative inspiration he needed to write his poetry. But his attachment to Laura was more than he or Nancy bargained for. Graves faced a choice: a creative life with Laura or a domestic life with his wife. He chose poetry and Laura. Graves didn't divorce Nancy, but he left her with their 4 children and moved with Laura to an apartment in London. But his new life with Laura was troubled too.
Laura was seen as a completely mad woman. I mean, the reports that appear in diaries of Laura throwing herself on the floor when she didn't get her own way, screaming. She was like a kind of spoilt child, a brilliant child, but a very willful child, and I would say quite a mad child.
Laura needed the devotion of more than just Graves. She wanted a third person back in their lives, but this time she wanted it to be a man of her choosing, a young poet named Geoffrey Phibbs. One night in their apartment, Laura confronted Phibbs and, with help from Graves, tried to persuade him to come and live with them. Phibbs' refusal literally sent Laura over the edge.
Laura, demented, I suppose, with rage and fury, opened the window, swung her legs out of the window, and said, "Goodbye, chaps," and jumped, and fell into the concrete arena below, 3 stories or 4 stories down. Graves, distraught with grief, he couldn't get out the window, it was too small, jumped out of the next big window on the stairs to try and get to her, or possibly to die with her. One doesn't know. He cracked his ribs. Laura broke her spine.
Miraculously, Laura survived, but she faced a long recovery in the hospital. Her close brush with death profoundly affected Graves. With his life in a state of chaos, he retreated to the solace of his study and returned to the subject of his first experience of chaos and upheaval, the war. When he emerged, he had written a caustic memoir entitled "Goodbye to All That." an unsentimental look back at the events of World War I, Graves dashed off the first draft in record time.
He told it as I might tell you a story now of my life. It was ad-libbed. And in a way, that is the great strength of Goodbye to All That. It has this incredible force of truth, the ring of truth, because it's a voice telling it how it seemed to be.
Goodbye to All That was a disturbing masterpiece of storytelling. It was an instant hit upon its publication in 1929 and established Graves as an up-and-coming writer. Like his earlier war poetry, the book pulled no punches when it touched on such taboo subjects as suicide in the trenches.
Going towards company headquarters to wake the officers, I saw a man lying on his face in a machine gun shelter. I stopped and said, "Stand to there." I flashed my torch on him and saw that one of his feet was bare. I shook the sleeper by the arm and noticed suddenly the hole in the back of his head. He had taken off the boot and sock to pull the trigger of his rifle with one toe. The muzzle was in his mouth.
Goodbye to All That was Graves' bitter farewell to England. He held nothing back, alienating his friends and family and making a clean break with his past. It was clear to Graves that things had to change, and they would. With profits from the success of Goodbye to All That and Laura able to walk again, the two packed up and sailed off to a new life on the Spanish island of Majorca. They settled in a small town called Bayha, the word for goddess in Greek. The name alone somehow confirmed that they'd come to the right place.
Here, there's a three-quarters of a circle of hills, and they're full of iron, which creates a curious magnetic field. And somebody told me that people in this village, as they go mad or become poets.
In Majorca, Graves plunged into life as a poet. Most of his time was spent writing and refining his poetry, sometimes writing more than 30 drafts of a single poem. The life he left behind in England was becoming a distant memory, and living so far from London's literary scene, he almost faded into obscurity.
From more or less 1930 until 1940, Graves was almost invisible to people. They would visit in Majorca, they'd barely see him. All they were conscious of was this formidably powerful character of Laura.
Laura, still recovering from her injuries, grew brutally demanding. And though Graves catered to her every need, her constantly manipulative behavior wore him thin. Meanwhile, after 3 years of devoting his life to poetry, his money was running out. Graves was once again on the brink. Needing a financial success that would bring in more money than poetry, he returned to prose and to the past. He chose the subject of ancient Rome and a little-known emperor, Claudius Tiberius. Graves holed up in his study for months while he conjured up his story of political intrigue, assassination, and betrayal.
I, Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, this, that, and the other, though I shall not trouble you yet with all my titles, am now about to write this strange history of my life.
In the story, Emperor Claudius is surrounded by treacherous women who attempt to control him like a puppet. In the end, Claudius prevails, and by the time he dies, he is revered as a god by his people. But for much of his life, Claudius is tormented by his double-crossing grandmother, Livia.
The Empress Livia, who is the kind of demonic presence in Claudius's life, is also very much based on Laura, and that kind of forceful quality, a woman who can bewitch anybody and control them, very much comes from Graves's sense of Laura riding.
She was a consummate actress, and the outward purity of her conduct, the sharpness of her wit, and the graciousness of her manners deceived nearly everybody. But nobody really liked her. She had a faculty for making ordinary, easygoing people feel acutely conscious in her presence of their intellectual and moral shortcomings.
There you have Laura riding, with all her manipulation and dominance and all the rest of it. And the dark side of Laura is there perfectly captured.
Laura riding herself could not stand Claudius. She ordered that it should never be mentioned in her presence. Part of this was that it had been extremely annoying for her to try to write bestsellers and then find that Graves had gone off and died instead of her. But I think the part she couldn't admit to was that she did not like seeing Graves's portrayal of herself in the books.
I, Claudius was a resounding success and saved Graves from financial disaster. It also marked a turning point in his relationship with Laura. The success of I, Claudius shifted the balance of power between them, and their relationship began to unravel. Eventually, Laura moved back to America. Graves didn't stand in her way. In the months prior to Laura's departure, Graves had quietly fallen in love with a stunning young beauty named Beryl Hodge, who was 20 years younger than himself. Soon after Laura left, Graves officially divorced his first wife, Nancy, and married Beryl.
Mercifully, he found himself with a very much more sensible and balanced woman who was not a poet, and I think that's the key to the success of his second marriage. She was not a woman who was ambitious for herself.
With Beryl, it was a different sort of love. It was unconditional. It was given without him needing to change himself or to do something to keep it, to maintain it.
In the blissful harmony of his marriage to Beryl, Graves wrote a series of passionate love poems considered to be among the best in modern literature.
She tells her love while half asleep in the dark hours, with half words whispered low, as earth stirs in her winter sleep and puts out grass and flowers despite the snow, despite the falling snow.
Graves had 4 more children with Beryl, and life on Majorca became an idyllic balance of devotion to poetry and family. But that balance was tragically shattered in 1943. Graves' oldest son, David, was killed in battle while serving as a soldier in World War II. The loss plunged Graves into a profound state of grief and guilt. He had encouraged David to fight in the war, and now his son was dead. Graves was besieged by the terrifying memory of his own close brush with death at the Somme. In this state of emotional turmoil, at the age of 46, Graves once again buried himself in his writing. It was then that he began to explore the link between his creativity and his feelings of terror, awe, and devotion. He embodied these emotions into a physical form, the divine being who demanded sacrifice in exchange for the fire of creative inspiration. Graves called her the White Goddess.
The price of poetry is high. And that's what the White Goddess book is about. It's about great poets are those who don't count the cost of writing poetry. They're prepared to live life in a way which throws themselves into experience, difficult, painful experience, and can come through to tell the truth about it.
The White Goddess is Graves' most visionary work of prose. In writing it, he finally understood that difficult and painful life experiences were the crucial ingredient he needed to fuel his creative spark. With this insight, Graves actively sought out ways to heighten these powerful emotions in his life. And so, with Beryl's tacit approval, he pursued a succession of intense and inspiring relationships with young women, whom he called his muses.
The muses would be extremely good-looking young women who would usually have a boyfriend, so they would not be available. They would cause Graves agony and pain. And it was almost always the same story. What would happen was that Graves would approach the muse, he would hand her a kind of quiverful, so to speak, of poems and say, "These have been inspired by you," and then scamper off back to his house in Beryl. What he wanted from them was a state of, "Here I am, but you can't quite get me. Here I am, but not quite yet." And in that state, he wrote his most remarkable love poetry.
Graves had found the formula that would sustain him for the rest of his career. He continued writing love poems into old age, even as his brilliant mind began to deteriorate.
It was during this period that Graves, very poignantly, I think, was aware that he was writing his poetry against the clock. He knew that his brain was beginning to go. And so his answer was to write more and more and more, faster and faster and faster.
In one of his final poems, called At the Gate, Graves wrote about his fears of losing touch with the awe-inspiring power of the white goddess.
And it describes standing in the garden of his gate in Mallorca, looking out down the road. And he's really waiting for the goddess to turn up again. And that's what he really wants. But maybe it's not going to happen again. Who knows? You could never predict it.
Where are poems? Why do I now write none? This can mean no lack of pens, nor lack of love, but need perhaps of an increased magic. Where have my ancient powers suddenly gone? Tonight I caught a glimpse of her at the gate, grappling a monster never found before, and jerking back its head. Had I come too late? Her eyes blaze fire, and I could look no more.
Graves ultimately lost his battle with the terrifying monster of Alzheimer's disease. He wrote his last poem at the age of 78, but lived another 12 years until his death in 1985. But long before he died, Robert Graves was recognized as one of the giants of 20th century literature.
He was part novelist, part poet, part mythologist. That is his strength and his genius.
For close to a century, Robert Graves' pursuit of poetic inspiration pushed him to create some of the most enduring works of modern literature.
It sounds rather unkind to say this because he was so brilliant, but the most brilliant people I've known in my life have always been a little bit closer to madness than the rest of us. And it's that which gives them this incredible edge.
And for Robert Graves, it was a madness fed by an intoxicating brew of awe, terror, pain, and devotion. For him, nothing less was enough to make great poetry and to appease the white goddess.
With you for mast and sail and flag, and anchor never known to drag, death's narrow but oppressive sea looks not unnavigable to me.